The snow came in sideways that morning, the way January snow does in the Judith Basin, not falling so much as driving, filling the world from the west until there was no horizon, no sky, no ground. Just one gray breathing wall pressing against everything that dared to stand upright. Cutter Vane rode into it with his chin pulled down and his duster collar high across the back of his neck. His horse, a Roman-nosed bay called Drum, knew the north fence line the way a man knows the hall of his own house, not by sight, but by feel, by the habit of repetition, by the small invisible markers worn into memory over years. 6 years on the Aldrich Range. 6 winters. Cutter had ridden this line so many times it had stopped being a job and started being a groove cut into his daily shape, like the callus on his right rein hand or the way he always checked the cinch twice before mounting, even when he knew it was right. He wasn't thinking about anything in particular. That was something he'd gotten very good at. The Aldrich Cattle Company ran 12,000 head across the Judith Basin, and in January of 1883, the outfit was burning through its hay reserves at a rate that kept the foreman, a barrel-chested Scotsman named McCreary, pacing the feed barn at odd hours, running figures in his head that didn't come out right. The winter had come early and mean, and showed no interest in negotiating. Cutter's orders were simple: ride the north fence each morning, check for breaks, turn back any drifting stock before they pushed through into the creek-fed lower quarter. He'd done it 4 mornings running, 4 mornings of fence posts, frozen wire, ice-heavy cottonwood branches hanging low enough to clip his hat brim, and nothing else. Drum stopped first. The horse planted his feet and drove air hard through both nostrils, swinging his head left and locking it there. Cutter pulled up without thinking, right hand dropping to the rifle stock by reflex, a motion so practiced it happened below thought. He sat still. 3 seconds. 5. The blizzard pressed against his back. Somewhere east, a frozen branch let out a long grinding moan under the weight of ice it had been carrying for 3 days. And then, below all of it, so faint, it could have been the snow itself shifting underfoot a sound, high and thin. The kind that comes from a body that has been past a point of loud crying for some time and is now down to its last small reserves. He turned Drum left and rode 30 yards off the fence line. The woman was on her hands and knees in the snow. One arm was wrapped around the smallest child, who lay pressed against her side with no movement visible from a distance. 2 other girls were close against her. The older one with both arms around her mother's neck. The younger one clutching a rag doll to her chest, with her eyes open and fixed on nothing. The vacant stare of a child whose body has stopped processing cold as pain and started processing it as simply nothing at all. All 4 of them wore what they grabbed in darkness and haste, coats thrown over nightdresses, one child without gloves, the smallest with no hat, her blonde hair flat and damp against her skull. They had made it 40 feet from the cabin door, which stood open wide behind them, the interior dark and still as a cave at depth. Cutter was off Drum before the horse fully stopped. He went to the smallest child first, a girl no older than 4. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck and found a pulse. Faint, present, something to work with. Her lips had gone the color of a fresh bruise. He unbuttoned his duster with one hand, drew her against his chest, and fastened the coat back over her with his jaw set, leaving only the pale oval of her face exposed. She made a sound against his sternum, not a cry. Something below crying the low, involuntary response of a body relearning that warmth was a thing that existed. The woman looked up at him, dark hair matted flat with snow. Her eyes held an expression he had seen before on men pulled out of collapsed mine shafts and women found after prairie fires, not quite fear, not quite relief, but the particular suspension of a person who has fought with everything they have for so long that the arrival of another human hasn't yet resolved into a category, help or threat, friend or instrument of whoever put her here. She hadn't sorted it, and she was too far gone to have the energy for sorting. "Can you walk?" he said. She tried to stand. Her right hand, the one that had been pressed palm down into the snow, had gone the color of old beeswax, and when she put weight on it, the arm buckled. Cutter got his right arm under her shoulders and lifted. She found her legs beneath her. He pointed the older girl, perhaps 9, her jaw set in a way that was the spitting copy of her mother's, and meant the same thing toward the cabin door, and said, "Go on in. Stand by the door." The girl went without a word. No hesitation, no looking back. She'd already been doing everything that needed doing for longer than she should have had to. He carried the middle child under his left arm and walked the woman across the snow. They covered the 40 feet. Inside, the cabin was cold as a dressed carcass in a February smokehouse. The hearth was out, not low, not banked down for the night, but fully extinguished, the ash undisturbed and white, the kind of ash that had been settling for hours. The fire had been dead since well before midnight. Cutter set the middle child down on the plank floor near the hearth, transferred the smallest from inside his coat to her mother's lap, and went to work. He built fires the way he did everything, without announcement and without waste. Kindling first pulled from the bottom of the wood box where it was driest. A handful of pine shavings curled from the inner wall of the box. 2 split logs crossed at the base of the firebox, tight enough to hold their position through the initial burn. He reached up for the flue damper to open the draw. It resisted. Not the ordinary stiffness of a damper that hadn't been moved in cold weather. Something else. Resistance with an edge to it, as though something had been wedged into the throat of the chimney shaft and not fully cleared. He pushed harder. The damper ground open. When he tilted his head to look up the shaft, the smell reached him. Coal, oil, and scorched cloth, close and recent, and above it, against the old black creosote of the chimney interior, a fresh scorched line, the signature of something that had been placed in the shaft deliberately and had begun to smolder before it was removed, or before it had done enough. A chimney flue packed with an oiled rag doesn't kill the fire cleanly. It fills the cabin with smoke first, drives out the heat, drives out the air worth breathing, drives out the family. Into a January blizzard. He filed that away in the back of his mind, like a stone placed in a coat pocket, and got the fire going. The wood box was half empty. Wrong for January. He looked around the cabin while the fire climbed the careful arrangement of boots by the door, smallest to largest. A bundle of dried herbs hung above the window, tied with string and positioned with intent. A Bible on the shelf with a length of ribbon marking a page, placed the way a person places something they return to regularly. A woman who ran her house with this kind of attention did not let her woodbox go half empty in the depth of winter with 3 daughters and no man's back to fill it. He went to drum, tied him to the porch post, brought his saddlebags and bedroll inside. 2 wool blankets. He wrapped the youngest child first. She was the one he was watching, then the middle girl, then the older one, who had positioned herself against the wall with her back straight and her eyes on him, cataloging everything he did. Nora, the woman. He gathered the name from the older girl, addressing her quietly across the room, sat holding the youngest against her chest and rocking, a motion she seemed unaware she was making. Cutter heated water in the single pot above the hearth, worked a strip of dried jerky into it until it dissolved into something approximating broth, and put the cup into Nora's hands before the fire had been burning 15 minutes. She drank it without looking at him. The middle girl, she was 6, maybe, with blonde hair that had gone wild in sleep and a rag doll she'd held against her chest through the entire ordeal, looked up from the doll and said, "Is Rue going to be all right?" "Yes," Cotter said. He said it the way a man states something that has been decided. Not a reassurance. A declaration. He settled against the wall across from the hearth and watched the fire do its work. Outside, the blizzard ran hard against the north and west faces of the cabin, and the walls held. Drum shifted on the porch and blew once. The youngest girl, Rue, stirred against her mother's chest, resettled, and breathed deeper. He should have been thinking about McCreary, about how long before someone rode out to check the fence line. He sat still. It was close to an hour before Nora spoke again. When she did, it wasn't directed at him. It wasn't directed at anyone. It was the voice of a woman whose mind was still partly back in whatever preceded the snow, running through the sequence, looking for the specific moment things turned and finding it every time in the same place. "They told us we had till spring," she said. Cutter looked at her. She was looking at the fire. He didn't ask what she meant. He should have asked. The storm didn't break that day. By mid-morning, it had settled into a deep, sustained note against the north wall, methodical and patient. The sound of weather with no obligation to hurry. Cutter fed the fire every 40 minutes and kept the wood box supplied from the small shed off the back of the cabin, which required going out twice through a door that fought him both ways. He didn't mind the cold. Cold was honest. You understood exactly where you stood. The 3 girls slept past noon, tangled together under his wool blankets and a heavy quilt he'd found folded at the foot of the back room's narrow bed. Greta, the oldest, the one with her mother's jaw, had one arm around Rue even in sleep, the instinct so practiced it had continued without waking. Rue's color had come back fully by the time the fire had been running 2 hours, and she breathed slow and deep, and eventually Cutter stopped watching her with the specific attention a man gives, something fragile that might still go either way. Ada woke before her sisters. She sat up inside the blanket, looked at the fire, looked at her mother against the far wall, and then turned that frank, uninhibited assessment toward Cutter with the patience of a child who has not yet learned to pretend she isn't studying someone. She held up the ragdoll. "Her name's Clara," she said. "That's a good name," Cutter said. Ada considered this with appropriate seriousness, tucked Clara back under the blanket's edge, and glanced toward the front of the cabin. "Is that your horse outside?" "It is." "What's his name?" "Drum." She thought it over. On account of his color? On account of the noise he makes when he's put out about something. The corner of Ada's mouth moved. She looked at her mother, a look that confirmed what she needed to confirm, and then settled back against Greta's shoulder and was asleep again within 2 minutes. Nora had watched the exchange from her side of the room. Something moved through her face, brief and layered, and then she looked back at the fire. "You ride for Aldrich," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd seen the brand on Drum's hip before they ever made it through the door. "I do," Cutter said. A pause long enough for the fire to pop twice. "My husband tried to sell to him," Nora said. 2 years running, the offer came through Fitch. 2 years running, Elias said no. The creek that runs through our lower quarter feeds Aldrich's summer stock through the dry months. Without that water, he'd have to pull his herd back 6 miles in any year that doesn't get August rain. Elias understood water. That's why we filed on this piece. She looked at the grain of the floorboards. Elias died in September. A green horse. Quick, at least. That's something. Cutter waited. 2 weeks after the burial, Fitch came to the door. He said Elias had left unpaid debts grazing rights he'd borrowed against on the south quarter. Papers for it and everything. I'd never heard Elias mention any such arrangement, but Fitch had documents and a county seal, and the kind of manner that tells you arguing isn't going to accomplish anything that day. Her hands lay open in her lap. He said I had till spring to settle, or the property would revert to the creditor. How much was the debt? Cutter said. She looked at him with something that was almost dry amusement, the kind that has all the humor worn off it and only the shape remaining. More than this land is worth to anyone except the man trying to take it. Cutter stood. He put his coat on without explaining himself and went out through the back door. He came around the exterior of the cabin to the chimney stack along the north wall. The snow was unbroken along that face, knee-deep, smooth, except for one set of boot prints that ran from the corner of the cabin to the base of the chimney and back again. The storm had half filled them, a day old, maybe less, wide-heeled, long-strided, a big man moving with purpose, not hesitation. At the base of the chimney stack, pushed half under the snow along the stone foundation, was a length of oiled rag, scorched at one end, reeking of coal oil even in the cold. Not large enough to permanently block the shaft, but large enough, placed in the right position, to restrict the draw through a night, enough smoke to kill the fire by 2 in the morning. Enough cold to drive a woman and her daughters out into the dark before they fully understood what was happening. He stood at the base of that chimney for a long moment. The wind cut across the top of his hat brim and drove ice into the back of his neck. He picked up the rag, looked at it once, and put it in his coat pocket. Then he stood still a moment longer, looking north across the wide basin, looking at nothing particular while he let what he was thinking settle into its proper shape. He went back inside. 20 miles to the south-southeast of the Callum homestead, in a 2-story log house with glass windows in every room and a cast-iron stove burning hardwood on each floor, Harlan Aldrich sat at his desk and ran a finger down a column of figures in his land acquisition ledger. He was a compact, deliberate man who did not raise his voice because he had never needed to. The world had always arranged itself around his preferences before it came to that. The Callum quarter section was entered in his ledger under the heading Pending Acquisition, with a notation in his own careful hand beside it, Creek Access Title Settlement Pending. He tapped the page once with his fingertip, the gesture of a man reviewing work that is nearly done. He looked up at Orson Fitch, who stood across the desk with his coat still on, warming his hands at the stove. "It should be settled by now," Aldrich said. Fitch shrugged in the way of a man who has found the gesture professionally useful. "Storm's been running 3 days. Road between here and that place is 4 feet under. I'd give it another week to resolve." "I don't want to give it another week," Aldrich said. He looked at his ledger. "I want it finished." Fitch picked his hat off the corner of the desk. "It'll finish," he said. "Weather like this, a woman alone, 3 young girls. It has a way of settling things." Aldrich did not respond. He looked at his figures. He did not look at Fitch again. Back in the Callum cabin, Cutter hung his coat and stood in the main room for a moment, looking at the back doorway. Then he went through it. The back room, the sleeping room, told him what sleeping rooms tell a man who knows how to read them. Narrow bed, tight made even now, the quilt straightened, despite everything. A trunk, latched. A shelf with 2 books placed spine out and a small tintype photograph of a man and woman on their wedding day, the man squinting slightly against the photographer's light. And along the wall beside the window, A loose board noticed because the nails around it were newer than the rest, replaced recently by someone who had not matched the original iron hardware and had not cared enough about the difference to correct it. He looked at the board for a moment. Then he pulled it. The space behind it was 4 inches deep and 18 wide. The careful work of a man who wanted something hidden and wanted it to stay hidden. Inside, a folded document sealed with a land office wax stamp and a sealed letter with handwriting on the front in a man's deliberate, unhurried script. To be opened if something happens to me. He brought both into the main room, set the folded document on the table, opened the letter. It was 4 pages, written in a hand that had been steadied by purpose, the writing of a man who understood he was running out of time and had chosen to use what remained carefully. Elias Callum laid out 3 years of it in plain, specific language. Creek water diverted upstream during the summer of 1880, blamed on an early drought. But Elias had ridden the creek above the diversion point and found the earthwork. A neighbor's fence moved 40 yards onto Callum, ground 2 winters prior. The matter dropped when the neighbor was visited by 2 men from the Aldrich outfit and abruptly agreed it had been his own surveying error. A fire at the Hennessy barn in September of 81 that the county had declined to investigate. Fitch's name appeared on the 3rd page, connected to the debt paperwork the documents drawn, Elias wrote, by a county clerk who owed Aldrich 3 years of back wages on a land loan. He named McCreary as the man who had coordinated the fence patrols that had kept the Callum place from receiving visitors from the Basin Road. He named dates, descriptions, specific acts, and in the middle of the 3rd page, in the body of a paragraph about the Aldrich outfit's management of the North Range, Elias Callum had written, "There is a rider from the Aldrich outfit who works the north fence every morning without fail. A quiet man, I have never heard him raise his voice or seen him make trouble with anyone. He does not stop at our fence. He does not speak to us, but he is there every morning. I have come to believe his presence is not incidental. I believe he rides that line specifically to ensure that no one traveling the Basin Road comes near our place or sees the state of our fence or has reason to stop and inquire. I don't know his name. He rides a Roman-nosed bay horse." Cutter read the paragraph once, then again, then a 3rd time, more slowly. The fire settled in the hearth. One of the girls shifted under the blanket and was still again. Outside, the wind moved along the north wall in one long, sustained note. He set the letter down on the table. He sat with his hands flat on either side of it and looked at the wall across from him and did not look at anything else for what may have been 2 minutes. When he looked up, Nora was watching him. She had been watching him, he understood, from the moment he walked out of the back room with the document and the letter. Her face held no accusation. That was the thing about it. No accusation, no anger, nothing that required him to defend himself against. What it held was something quieter and more difficult than anger. The expression of a woman who has had enough time, sitting alone in a cold cabin through a long winter, to understand exactly what had been done to her, and who had been used to do it, and who has been waiting, without particular expectation, to see whether the understanding would arrive in any of the men who had been used. He looked at her. He had nothing to say that was worth the weight of saying it. She looked back at him and said nothing either. The storm broke before dawn. It didn't taper. It stopped the way hard things in the Judith Basin tended to stop the wind dropping in under an hour. From a sustained roar to silence so complete that the creak of the fire settling sounded like a statement. By the time pale light began to separate itself from the darkness at the eastern edge of the sky, the world outside was still and buried, and so thoroughly quiet that Cutter could hear Drum breathing at the porch post 20 feet away. He hadn't slept. He'd fed the fire through the night and sat with the letter on the table in front of him and looked at the wall and worked through what could be worked through. Not all of it. A man didn't work through all of something like this in a single night, but enough to understand what the daylight hours required. Greta came out of the back room first, the way she'd been coming out first since September, he supposed. She found him at the table, registered him, and stopped in the doorway to assess whether the situation had changed in any meaningful way overnight. 9 years old. She had gotten her sisters and her mother out of a smoke-filled cabin in the dark of a blizzard and kept them alive 40 feet into the open before her own legs gave out. She looked at him with her mother's eyes across the table. He nodded once, so she'd know the situation was stable. She nodded back and went to the hearth to get warm. No drama, no commentary. Just the economy of a child who has learned that drama costs more than it returns. Nora came out last. She looked at the letter on the table, then at him. "Did you know?" she said. He'd been deciding how to answer that for several hours. He gave her the true answer instead of the careful one. Not the way knowing means knowing, he said. I understood the fence ride had a purpose beyond the fence. I didn't ask what the purpose was. I made a habit of not asking. She looked at him steadily. That's an honest thing to say. Not absolution, not condemnation. Just acknowledgement, the recognition that honesty had arrived, late, and was still worth something. He picked up the deed from the table, the folded document with a land office wax seal. He held it up between them. This is your title. Original filing, 1,879 in Elias's name. Aldrich's debt claim is constructed. If this gets filed at the county land office in Lewistown and entered into the permanent record before Fitch does anything further to the county books, the claim has no standing. Nora looked at the deed. Lewistown is 22 miles. I know where Lewistown is. The roads, after 3 days of... I know what the roads are, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to her daughters, and Cutter understood that the conversation was finished in the way that mattered. She hadn't told him to go, and she hadn't told him not to, and that was all the answer the situation required. He went out and saddled Drum. The Judith Basin, after a 3-day blizzard, was an altered country. The storm had reformed everything. Fence lines become low, white ridges, creek bottoms, buried under 4 smooth feet of unmarked snow that made them indistinguishable from solid ground until you were in them. The cottonwoods along the draws stood stripped and black against a sky that was going from pale gray to the particular washed blue that follows hard weather, their branches carrying ice that caught the early light and threw it back in brief, cold flashes. Drum moved into it with a patient, deliberate gait of a horse that has worked deep snow before weight forward on the downslopes, reaching and testing on the flat, conserving what he'd need for the long haul. Cutter gave him his head on the level ground and steadied him through the creek crossing, where the top crust of ice had been driven down into the solid pack below by the storm's weight and held their crossing. Then the long climb to the Basin Road and south. From the ridge above the first climb, Cutter could see 15 miles in the clear post-storm air. The basin lay out below him like something drawn in white and gray, with one careful hand. To the southeast, the Aldrich main house sat against the landscape, with its windows catching the early light, the chimney smoke rising perfectly straight into the still air. He looked at it for the space of 3 breaths. Then he turned Drum south and did not look back. The road was rough and slow, drifted in places to the fence rails, open in others where the wind had scoured the hardpack clean. He kept Drum to a pace that was sustainable over distance rather than impressive over a quarter mile. The cold was the dry, crystalline cold that follows a cleared storm, and it had teeth. But it was honest cold, expected cold, the kind that asked nothing of you except acknowledgement. 2.5 hours after leaving the Callum place, he came down off the last rise into the outskirts of Lewistown. The town was shaking itself loose after 3 days under men shoveling boardwalks, a livery horse being walked in tight circles to work the stiffness out, a freight wagon attempting the main street with the grim optimism of a man who has committed to something he already regrets. The land office occupied the northeast corner of a building it shared with the county recorder. Its door had been freshly shoveled. Someone had been there already this morning. Orson Fitch's gray horse, thick-necked, notched left ear, unmistakable, was tied at the rail out front. Cutter sat Drum in the street and looked at the animal for 10 seconds while he let the fact of it arrange itself into its proper meaning. Then he dismounted, tied Drum 2 posts down, and went through the door. One room. A pine counter running the width of it. A clerk, young, ink-stained, the look of a man hoping to be somewhere else behind the counter. Fitch stood at the counter with his back to the door, speaking in the low, unhurried tone of a man having a conversation he once contained. A folder of papers lay open between him and the clerk. Fitch turned when the hinges moved. When he saw Cutter, his face traveled through 3 things: quickly surprise, recalculation, and then a kind of settling, the face of a man deciding his play with an unexpected card on the table. "Vain," he said. "Fitch." Cutter walked to the counter. He reached past Fitch, not touching him, and set the Callum deed in front of the clerk. "I need this entered into the county record," he said. "Original homestead title, Elias Callum, quarter section on the North Judith Creek, filed 1879. I'm asking for it to be stamped and logged today." The clerk looked at the document, looked at Fitch, looked back at Cutter. "Don't touch that," Fitch said. His voice had gone flat. "Vain. You don't have the standing to file on behalf of—" "I'm not filing on behalf of anyone," Cutter said. "I'm presenting an original document for county record. That's the clerk's job." He looked at the clerk. "Do your job." Fitch put his hand on the deed. Cutter looked at the hand. Then he looked at Fitch directly, without speed, without anger, without any of the theatrical preparation that men who are bluffing tend to put into such moments. There was something in his face that was older than anger, something that had been arrived at slowly over the course of a night spent sitting at a table with a dead man's letter, and that had nothing left to prove to anyone and was no longer in any particular hurry. Whatever Fitch was looking for in Cutter's eyes, hesitation, the manageable kind of resolve, he didn't find it. Fitch took his hand off the deed. The clerk filed it. It took 11 minutes, the entry logged, the deed stamped, a notation made in the county record book in ink that would not come out without tearing the page. When the clerk slid the stamped copy across the counter, Cutter folded it, put it inside his coat, and left without acknowledging Fitch again. Outside, the January air hit him direct and clean. Drum turned his head with the patient inquiry of a horse ready to go somewhere. Cutter untied him and stood for a moment in the cold street. He'd ridden the north fence for 6 years. He'd delivered messages he didn't read. He'd kept his head down and his questions to himself, and told himself that was just the nature of work in a place where asking questions could get a man fired, or worse, and he'd believed that, or he'd allowed himself to believe it, which was a different thing entirely. He'd been useful to men who needed silence. He'd provided it without ever examining what the silence was covering. He stood in the cleared street of Lewistown, Montana Territory, in January of 1883, and he understood himself with a clarity that had no comfortable application. Then he mounted up and rode north. He reached the Callum place in the early afternoon, when the low winter sun had angled far enough west to throw blue shadows long across the snow from every fence post and leafless branch. The cabin's chimney put out a clean, straight column of smoke against the pale sky. Through the single window, lamplight glowed amber against the gray outside the particular warm light of a room where people are gathered close to a fire, doing the ordinary work of a winter afternoon. He went inside. The three girls were at the table. Rue sat upright on her own now, color full in her cheeks, focused with great concentration on balancing a wooden spoon across one finger while Ada watched with the grave attention of a scientific observer. Greta was reading or attempting to, with one eye on her sisters. Nora stood at the hearth with her back to the door, and she turned when he came in without the tension of a woman who doesn't know what to expect, which told him she'd heard Drum on the approach road and had made her own calculations. He held up the stamped copy of the deed, set it on the table beside Rue's spoon. Nora looked at it without crossing the room to pick it up. He reached into his coat and brought out his wages 3 weeks from McCreary's last pay, coins folded in a cloth. He set them beside the deed. Nora looked at the coins. "You don't." "I know," he said. He picked up his saddlebags from the corner where he'd left them the previous morning. He put on his coat. Rue looked up from her spoon experiment and fixed him with the direct attention of a 4-year-old who has recently and personally learned that when a person leaves, they do not always come back. "Are you coming back?" she said. He looked at the girl for a moment, the question asked, without drama, without expectation, without anything except the simple requirement of a true answer. "I don't know," he said, which was the only honest thing he had. He went outside. Drum waited at the post, breath making brief clouds in the cold air. Cutter stood beside him and didn't mount immediately. He looked at the cabin, the chimney smoke rising clean, the warm window, the tracks in the snow going in and out and in again across the last 20 hours. He thought about Elias Callum writing 4 pages in a steady hand and sealing them behind a board and taking the time to describe a man on a Roman-nosed bay, and hoping, without any particular reason, to hope that the description might someday land in front of someone worth more than what he'd been. The basin lay out in every direction, white and enormous, and indifferent to the particulars of any one man's reckoning. There's a question this story leaves unanswered, that no filed deed can settle. How many mornings had he ridden that fence without once asking what it was for? That question doesn't belong only to Cutter Vane. It belongs to anyone who has ever made a habit of not asking. If a story like this one earns a place in your week, subscribe and come back. We write out again soon, and there are more stories from this ground worth knowing.